There is a category of military report that does not appear in standard threat assessments, does not fit the vocabulary of conventional intelligence analysis, and for most of the 20th century was handled through a combination of informal classification and institutional silence that amounted to a policy of deliberate non-engagement with its contents. These reports describe objects, sometimes tracked by radar, sometimes recorded on infrared sensors, sometimes observed simultaneously by multiple trained personnel, that enter the ocean at high speed without the deceleration signature that physics requires of any object transitioning from air to water, that travel through water at speeds that no known submarine technology can approach, and that in some cases transition back out of the water into the air with the same absence of expected physical signatures. They are called USOs, Unidentified Submerged Objects, and their relationship to the broader category of unidentified aerial phenomena is, in the most recent declassified reporting from multiple national military establishments, described not as a coincidence or a misidentification error, but as a behavioral pattern. Objects that move between media, between air and ocean, as though the boundary between the two presents no physical challenge worth acknowledging. The military personnel who have reported these objects are not anonymous sources or civilian eyewitnesses. They are naval officers, submarine commanders, anti-submarine warfare specialists, sensor operators, and pilots whose professional lives are spent in precise technical observation of the maritime environment and whose training specifically equips them to distinguish between real anomalous targets and the misinterpretations, sensor artifacts, and environmental effects that produce false readings in the complex acoustic and electromagnetic environment of the ocean. When these people file formal reports describing objects that behave in ways inconsistent with any known physics, the question of what to do with those reports has become, in the period since 2019, an increasingly public and increasingly uncomfortable institutional question for the military establishments of the United States, Chile, Russia, and several other nations whose naval forces operate in the deep ocean. The modern institutional engagement with USO reports in the United States military began formally with the 2019 disclosure that the Navy had updated its reporting procedures for UAP, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, specifically to create a formal channel through which active duty personnel could report encounters without career risk. This policy change was driven in part by the public emergence of the Nimitz encounter video, footage from November 2004 in which USS Princeton's SPY-1 radar had been tracking anomalous objects for weeks before fighter pilots from USS Nimitz were directed to investigate and filmed an object exhibiting flight characteristics, including sudden acceleration, altitude changes from 80,000 feet to sea level in seconds, and hovering with no visible means of lift or propulsion, that no known aircraft could replicate. The Princeton sensor operators described the objects as appearing on radar at extremely high altitudes, dropping to sea level at speeds that should have been physically impossible, and then appearing to loiter at low altitude before the intercept. What the initial public discussion of the Nimitz encounter footage did not emphasize was the element of the encounter that the pilots described as among its most striking features: the object's behavior at the ocean surface. The pilots reported observing an area of disturbed water, a churning white disturbance on the otherwise calm ocean surface. that they described as consistent with a large submerged object moving just below the surface. Or the aerial object they were observing appeared to be interacting with or monitoring this disturbance. Whether the submerged disturbance represented a second object, a related phenomenon, or something else entirely was not established. But its inclusion in the pilot's formal reports placed the Nimitz encounter at the intersection of the aerial and submerged phenomena categories that would subsequently become central to the congressional UAP investigation. The United States congressional hearings on UAP that began in 2022 and continued through 2023 and 2024 produced sworn testimony from active and former military personnel that, for the first time in the history of the institutional engagement with these phenomena, was delivered in a format that created a formal public record. Well, among the most significant testimony in the context of USO phenomena was that of retired Navy Commander David Fravor, who had led the 2004 Nimitz intercept and whose account of the encounter, delivered under oath with the specificity of a professional pilot describing a technical observation, placed on the record a description of object behavior that had no conventional explanation. Fravor described the object as having no wings, no exhaust, no visible propulsion of any kind, and as accelerating from a stationary hover to supersonic speed without any visible mechanism. Also significant was the testimony of David Grush, a former intelligence official who testified under oath about what he described as a long-standing classified program involving materials and craft of non-human origin that had been managed outside normal congressional oversight. The specific relevance of Grush's testimony to USO phenomena was his description of objects that were recovered from or associated with maritime environments. Objects found in or near water in circumstances suggesting that the ocean had been used as an operating environment or concealment medium by whatever was producing these phenomena. While the precise details of classified programs cannot be independently verified through open sources, the willingness of a former intelligence official to deliver this testimony under oath, under penalty of perjury, with legal representation, in a formal congressional proceeding, represented a qualitative change in the public record of institutional engagement with these questions that has not been matched in any previous era of the phenomenon's documented history. The Chilean Navy's engagement with USO and UAP phenomena represents one of the most thoroughly documented cases in the international record of military USO encounters. In 2014, a Chilean Navy helicopter conducting a routine coastal patrol filmed an unidentified object using its FLIR, forward-looking infrared, sensor over a period of approximately 9 minutes. The object traveled at speeds consistent with a fast aircraft, produced no visible exhaust or propulsion signature on the infrared sensor despite the sensor's sensitivity to thermal emissions, and at several points appeared to eject material into the clouds ahead of it before the material was reabsorbed. The FLIR operator and the helicopter crew, experienced aviation professionals, made multiple attempts to communicate with the object on standard aviation frequencies and received no response. The video was analyzed for 2 years by a committee of Chilean Air Force specialists, meteorologists, oceanographers, and other technical experts before CEFAA, Chile's official government body for the investigation of UAP, released it publicly with the conclusion that the object was real, physical, and unidentified by any conventional explanation. What gives the Chilean case particular relevance to the USO context is the broader pattern of naval encounters in Chilean waters. The Chilean Navy has a documented history of reporting encounters with objects that enter and exit the Pacific from the coastal waters of Chile and that have been tracked behaving in ways inconsistent with both known aviation and known submarine technology, including performing rapid depth changes and surface-to-air transitions in conditions that would be catastrophically lethal to any known submersible operating within the physics of cavitation and water pressure. The Russian Navy's documented encounters with USO phenomena represent the oldest and, in some respects, the most operationally detailed institutional record of military engagement with anomalous underwater objects. The declassified reports, released in part through Russian investigative journalism in the 1990s and in part through formal government releases, describe encounters concentrated in several specific geographic regions including the Barents Sea, Lake Baikal, and the deep waters of the Pacific. A 1965 declassified Russian naval report describes an encounter in the Barents Sea in which a Soviet submarine being tracked by anomalous sonar contacts observed objects that were classified at the time as potentially experimental American technology, but that exhibited speeds and depth change rates that Russian naval analysts calculated were inconsistent with any known submarine design, including classified programs whose parameters the analysts had access to. And a separate report from the 1970s describes a situation in which multiple Soviet naval vessels tracked an unidentified underwater object that accelerated to a speed calculated at over 200 knots before the contact disappeared from sonar. A speed that no known technology, including the later supercavitating Shkval torpedo, could produce in a large vehicle. The Lake Baikal encounters. Reports from Russian Navy diving operations in the world's deepest freshwater lake that describe encounters with unusual humanoid figures and unidentified objects at significant depths are among the more extraordinary elements of the Russian USO record and are simultaneously among the most difficult to independently verify, given their classification history and the political circumstances of their partial release. What is consistent across the Russian naval encounter record, as with the American and Chilean records, is the pattern of multiple independent trained observers reporting objects with specific, consistent behavioral characteristics. Primarily transmedium capability, speed anomalies, and the absence of expected physical signatures of propulsion that collectively define a category of phenomenon rather than a collection of unrelated misidentifications. The physics of what USOs are reported to do represents the most fundamental challenge to conventional explanations of these encounters. The transition from air to water at high speed is, in conventional physics, a catastrophically violent event. The density difference between air and water is approximately 800 to 1, it meaning that an object moving at aircraft speeds, when it contacts the water surface, experiences a deceleration force equivalent to striking a concrete wall, a force that destroys conventional aircraft in milliseconds and that requires purpose-built projectiles like torpedoes to be engineered specifically to survive the water entry event. The objects in USO reports do not exhibit this deceleration. They enter the water at speeds that military radar tracks as consistent with high-performance aircraft and continue at speeds through the water that sonar operators and radar tracking systems record as far in excess of anything achievable by known submarine technology. The fastest known torpedoes, the Russian Shkval supercavitating torpedo, achieve approximately 220 kilometers per hour through water by creating a bubble of vapor around themselves that reduces hydrodynamic drag to near zero. This supercavitation technology, which represents the current frontier of high-speed underwater propulsion, is noisy, thermally visible, unstable at turns, and limited in range by its fuel capacity. USOs reported in multiple military encounters have been tracked at speeds that some analysts have estimated, based on available sensor data, as exceeding this figure by factors of 10 or more, while executing turns that would subject any known vehicle structure to G-forces many times greater than any known material could withstand. The absence of any known propulsion mechanism that could produce these speeds without heat signature, acoustic signature, or visible physical effect on the surrounding water, which would show as a distinctive wake and pressure wave detectable by any competent sonar operator, is precisely what places these reports outside the explanatory framework of known physics and engineering. A submarine moving at the speeds recorded in USO reports using any known propulsion system would be detectable from significant distances by its acoustic and thermal signatures. The objects in these reports are not. The question that the documented record of USO encounters ultimately poses is one that the institutional frameworks of the military and intelligence establishments involved have historically been poorly equipped to engage. What is the correct procedure when the observed phenomenon does not fit any category in the threat assessment matrix? The three principal explanations that serious analysts bring to USO encounter data are adversarial technology, natural phenomena, and unknown origin. The adversarial technology explanation, that USOs represent classified programs of a known nation-state operating with technology far beyond publicly known capabilities, is the explanation most institutionally comfortable for military establishments because it fits within the existing framework of technological competition and intelligence assessment. It has the disadvantage of requiring the positing of a technological leap so large that it would represent not an incremental advance, but a revolutionary change in the fundamental physics of propulsion and materials that no publicly available scientific literature in any country supports. And, moreover, that any adversary capable of such technology would already have employed it in conventional military contexts where its advantages would be decisive. The natural phenomena explanation, that USOs are misidentifications of atmospheric, oceanographic, or geophysical events, is adequate for some reports and represents the correct explanation for a fraction of the encounters in the record, but fails to account for the specific, consistent behavioral characteristics reported by multiple independent trained observers across different sensor systems in different geographic locations across decades of encounters. Misidentification does not produce consistent reports of trans-medium transition, sustained underwater velocity, and absence of propulsion signature across multiple nations' naval encounter records spanning 50 years. The unknown origin explanation is the one that the institutional frameworks have historically refused to formally consider because its implications for policy, for resource allocation, for public communication, and for the foundational assumptions of the strategic environment are too large and too disruptive to engage with through the existing structures of national security decision-making. The UAP hearings of 2022 through 2025 represent the first sustained attempt by any major government to create a formal institutional structure capable of engaging with that third explanation on its own terms, without prejudging the conclusion and without the informal classification practices that have, for most of the past century, ensured that the reports remained inside the system without ever requiring the system to answer for what they contained. What the documented record of USO encounters, the declassified military reports, the congressional testimony, the sensor data, the multi-observer accounts from trained personnel across multiple national naval establishments. Ultimately, presence is not a mystery in the popular sense of an entertaining puzzle whose solution is satisfying to speculate about, or it presents a genuine empirical problem. Objects with consistent, specific, documented behavioral characteristics have been recorded by multiple independent technical systems in multiple geographic locations over a period of decades, by personnel whose professional training specifically equips them to distinguish real anomalous targets from misinterpretations. The characteristics of these objects: trans-medium operation, anomalous speed, absence of propulsion signatures, absence of expected physical interaction with the medium they move through, are not explained by any publicly known physics or engineering. The institutional history of these reports is one of systematic non-engagement that has prevented the accumulation of the systematic observational data that would be necessary to resolve the empirical question of what these objects are. The personnel who filed the reports were not rewarded for doing so. The systems that recorded the data were not redirected to collect more of it. The analytical resources that could have been directed at this dataset were not directed at it. For most of the past century, the institutional response to USO reports has been to absorb them into classification systems and administrative procedures that ensured they would not have to be explained, rather than to treat them as observational data that required explanation. What the period since 2019 represents is a partial and incomplete reversal of that institutional posture, a recognition driven partly by congressional pressure and partly by the accumulation of sensor data too high quality to dismiss, that the non-engagement approach had not made the reports go away and had not made the question easier to answer. The ocean covers 70% of the planet's surface, extends to depths of nearly 11 kilometers, and is monitored by the most sophisticated sensor networks that human technology has produced. And yet the overwhelming majority of that volume remains unobserved, unmapped, and unmonitored in any continuous way. Whatever is producing the reports in the USO record is doing so in an environment that is simultaneously the most observed and the most unknown on the surface of the Earth. And the gap between those two things, between what we can monitor and what we do not know, is precisely where the question lives, and precisely where it has always lived, patient and unresolved, moving through the dark water at speeds that should be impossible and leaving nothing behind to explain what passed.